Readings of Almighty God's Words. Exposing Antichrists. Item 10. They despise the truth, brazenly flout principles, and ignore the arrangements of God's house. Part 5. Antichrists consider themselves to be grand, great, and noble. If they are to read God's words, they must choose the divine utterances, the words spoken by God from the third heaven, or read some profound words of God that are difficult for common and ordinary people to understand and thoroughly perceive. What they desire in God's words is not the truth or a path to practice, but to satisfy their curiosity, their empty thoughts, and their ambitions and desires. So, if you see some people around you disregarding the more common and easily understood parts of God's words, the words of God spoken from the perspective of humanity, or not even singing them when set to music, and rather looking at, listening to, or reading God's words in a selective way instead, such people have a problem. Some might ask, what kind of problem? Is it a problem with their thinking or a psychological problem? It's neither. Such people have a problem with their disposition. Have you noticed that some people, when singing hymns of God's words, don't sing those related to truths about daily life, that they're unwilling to sing hymns about knowing oneself, those exposing people's corrupt dispositions, religious notions, and erroneous views of believing in God, as well as those in which God requires people to be honest. Particularly regarding the words and content of God's incarnation, the hymns that testify for the humbleness and hiddenness of God, that praise and testify for God incarnate, they won't sing a word of them, and they feel repulsed as soon as someone else starts singing them. But when they sing about testifying for and praising the God in heaven, the Spirit of God, about testifying for God's righteous disposition, transcendence, deeds, administrative decrees, and wrath, they sing with great enthusiasm and even reveal an indescribable expression. When they sing such hymns, they become bizarre. Their facial features contort, and their evil demeanor emerges. When singing about God's righteous and majestic disposition, they pound the table and stomp their feet, reaching a degree of fury. When it's about God's wrath being unleashed and bringing great disasters upon all humankind, they sing with clenched teeth, their faces red and swollen. Isn't there a problem with the spirit of such people? For instance, God says, "When I unleash great wrath, the nations will be shaken." After setting this statement to a melody, it changes from the first person and becomes, "When God unleashes great wrath, the nations will be shaken," in the third person. The normal mentality is that these are God's words, that this is understanding God's disposition through singing His words, and understanding God's disposition and the mentality and context of God, speaking from a third-person human perspective. This is the reason and reaction of normal humanity. But how do antichrists sing it? They don't change the third person, but their mindset is different from that of normal people. When normal people sing God, they think, these are God's deeds, God's words. This is what God says. But what about when antichrists sing? Their mindset is, this is what I have done, what I have said, the wrath I will unleash, the disposition I will reveal. Isn't this different? Although they don't dare to openly sing in front of everyone, when I unleash great wrath, the nations will be shaken. That's how they sing it in their hearts. They think it's themselves unleashing the wrath and causing the nations to be shaken, so they sing these words with genuine emotion. Doesn't this indicate a problem within them? From the beginning to the end, the reason antichrists do not acknowledge God is because they want to be God. They want to establish themselves while denying God, making people believe they are God and acknowledge them as the God of humankind. That's exactly what it is. Therefore, when reading a passage where God speaks in His divinity, people with the reason of normal humanity comprehend and pray-read it from a third-person perspective, pondering God's intentions. Antichrists, however, are different. As they sing or read these words, they are experiencing the urge to express such a disposition, to live within such a disposition and essence themselves. They aim to replace God, attempting to imitate God's speaking tone, manner, diction, and disposition within God's utterances, the tone of His speech, all His expressions, and the dispositions He reveals. They are thoroughgoing antichrists. Because they cannot speak as God does, cannot express God's disposition, and they fail at their imitation. When God speaks in His divinity, antichrists finally see their chance to imitate God and attempt to be God. God's utterances from the perspective of His divinity provide antichrists with clues and direction, letting them know how God speaks, the tone He uses to address man, and the manner, perspective, and intonation He uses to address man. This is one of their goals in cherishing and worshiping God's words uttered in His divinity. Therefore, in daily life, it's often possible to see some people imitating God's tone to lecture others under the pretext of being responsible for the work of God's house, or for the life of the brothers and sisters. They even quote God's words verbatim to lecture, condemn, prune, and expose people. The purpose behind their actions, when examined from the root and context of many facts, is not genuinely out of loyalty, a sense of justice, or responsibility. Instead, they attempt to do God's work from God's position and from God's perspective, and aim to replace God. Some people say, they never said they wanted to replace God. There's no need for them to say it. One can tell just by observing their actions, essence, root, and motivation. It can be determined that this is the disturbance and methods of an antichrist. Regardless of the manifestation, wanting to be God, harboring this intent in any way, is that what a person with the reason of normal humanity should do?
No.
Can such a person be characterized as an antichrist based on this alone? This point alone is sufficient. no matter how great your stature, if you always want to be God and are recklessly imitating God, demanding others to regard and treat you as God, such actions, behaviors, and dispositions constitute the essence of an Antichrist. This point alone is enough to characterize one as an Antichrist. It's not an Antichrist's disposition or a trace of an Antichrist's behavior, but a manifestation of having an Antichrist's essence. Tell me which is more serious in nature, wanting to be God or having ambitions and desires to always seek status.
Wanting to be God.
People have ambitions, arrogant dispositions, and like to assert their status, sometimes enjoying the benefits this status begets, treasuring it. This is a corrupt disposition, and it can change. However, wanting to be God, imitating God's speaking tone, imitating God's way of speaking, and even quoting God's words completely, reciting them verbatim to make others mistakenly think one can speak and act just like God. Their tone and manner of speaking so similar to God's, ultimately leading others to mistakenly believe they are God or just about the same as God, and even some treating them as God. That's problematic. It's an incurable issue, an irredeemable sickness. Is wanting to be God a trivial matter? God's identity is determined by His essence. The essence and disposition of the flesh in which God is incarnate are not obtained through His personal efforts, or cultivated by society, nations, humankind, or any individual, nor even cultivated by God Himself. Instead, God inherently possesses God's essence. He doesn't need human aid or cooperation, nor any environmental or temporal changes. God has His identity as God, so His essence has long since been predetermined. It is something innate. His ability to express the truth is not something He learned from humans, nor is it something that was cultivated by them either. Antichrists fail to perceive this matter thoroughly. Foolishly, they believe that if they can imitate God's speaking tone and manner so well that people regard them as more godlike, then they qualify to be God. Moreover, by saying some empty, impractical, incomprehensible so-called words of God that leave people clueless and lost, they think people might consider them as God, and they might have the chance to become God. Isn't this a dangerous matter? The desire and ambition to become God are always stirring in the hearts of antichrists. While they disclaim and condemn God's words, they also imitate His tone of speaking. What a despicable, wicked, shameless, and vile act! They are obsessed and deranged with the desire to be God. Isn't that disgusting? Do any of you harbor a desire to be God? Whoever wants to be God will be condemned. Whoever wants to be God will perish. This is a fact, not an exaggeration or an attempt to scare you. Don't believe it? Try it. Think in that direction, then act on it, and see if you can bear it internally. See what it feels like inside. If inside you feel pleased, proud, and satisfied with such actions, then you're no good and you're in danger. But if acting that way makes you feel self-reproach, guilty in conscience, too ashamed to face other people or God, then you have some conscience, some rationality of normal humanity. Many people aspire to be God. Without understanding what God's incarnation is, without knowing the tone and manner of God's speech, without grasping this information, they might be interested in the idea and have ambitions and plans. But not knowing how to proceed, they dare not act recklessly. At most, they pretend to be spiritual, to be saved, holy, or eligible for salvation. However, once they acquire some information about God, their ambitions begin to sprout, and they start to act. What do? A clear manifestation is that they read more of the profound and unfathomable words spoken by God. In these words, they familiarize themselves with the attitude, manner, tone, and diction of God's speech, and then they attempt to imitate these, studying them deeply. The more familiar the better, to the point where they can sense the tone and manner of God's speech, even with their eyes closed. They earnestly memorize these, and simultaneously practice and rehearse among people, imitating this style, manner, tone, and diction in their speech, and then deeply experiencing whether acting and speaking this way gives them a feeling of being God. As they become more familiar and skilled with the practice, they unknowingly place themselves in God's position. Suddenly, one day, someone says, "The feeling and tone of their speech seem close to God's. Speaking with them feels like being with God. Their words have the flavor of God's speech." After inadvertently hearing such remarks, their hearts fill with boundless satisfaction, feeling that they have finally achieved their wish, finally become God. Aren't they done for now? Why choose the path of destruction when there are other paths to walk? Isn't this seeking death? Even harboring such thoughts is dangerous. Turning these thoughts into actions is even more so. If one's actions spiral out of control and they follow this direction to the end, determined to succeed in it and make it a reality, then they become a target of complete destruction. Some antichrists are actually working and striving in this direction. Have you seen or come into contact with such people?
When I was in mainland China, I met someone who imitated God's tone of speech and often harbored the thought of being God. At that time, 2 or 3 people regarded her as God, and one person even knelt and prostrated before her when he saw her.
No matter to what extent a person tries to be God, it's a dead-end road. Have you seen through this? The expressions and provisions of all of God's words for humankind are meant to help people understand God's intentions and thus achieve salvation. If people mistakenly believe that since God has expressed these messages, they should glean from them the details of becoming God, and thus pursue being God, imitating God, and becoming God, then it's over for them. This is the path to destruction. You must never imitate this. Some people say, it's a bit difficult not to imitate God. Every time I hear God speak, I think how dignified and imposing it sounds to speak from God's identity. Why does it sound so pleasant and captivating? Why do I think it must feel so good to be God when God speaks? It sounds so different when the person with God's identity speaks. Thus, unconsciously, they start to mimic some of God's tone and diction. Although, in their subjective desires, they might not want to be God or become God so explicitly. What is their imitation rooted in? Is it because they cherish the truth and God's words?
No.
Then what is it?
It stems from the motive of wanting to be God.
If I didn't have this identity or status and said these words, would anyone imitate me? No one would bother with me. No one would think highly of me. Isn't that the fact? When I didn't have this identity and status, I also talked and fellowshipped with people. Who took me seriously then? As soon as they saw that I was young, lacking in advanced education or qualifications, and without any social status, nobody from my own church or any other churches, nor any of the people doing their duties and interacting with me, really took me seriously. Even if I spoke correctly or sincerely, no one paid attention. Why? Without identity or status, you lack presence. Whatever you say doesn't matter, even if it's correct or the truth. It might even be that people deny whatever you say, claiming it's all wrong. Then, would anyone imitate you? A very average and ordinary person, without identity or status, who would bother to imitate you? In people's eyes, such a person lacks presence and isn't worth admiring. You're lucky if they don't bully you. What would be the use of imitating you? Would they imitate you just so others could look down on, bully, and discriminate them? Who do people imitate? They imitate those who, in their eyes, have presence and grandeur, those with status and identity. People imitate these individuals. Why does the same person, once they acquire a certain identity and status, seem different in the eyes of others when they say the same things? How do they suddenly appear to have presence and be worth imitating? What are people really imitating? What they accept, mimic, and adore isn't the truth or positive things, but rather the external grandeur, the superficial status. Isn't that the case? If I had no identity or status, no matter how much I spoke in line with the truth or how many spiritual words I spoke, could those words be spread among you? No, no one would bother with it. But once I have my identity and status, some of the words I often say, my colloquialisms, my diction, my manner and style of speaking, many people start to imitate these. It makes me disgusted to hear this. How disgusted? I feel like vomiting when I hear it. I am disgusted by whoever imitates me. I am sickened by whoever imitates me, even to the point of condemning them. What is the intention and goal behind people imitating these things? It's to mimic the tone of God's speech, to get a taste of what it feels like to be God. Isn't that the fact? It's about wanting status, wanting to speak from a position of status, speaking and acting with the tone and manner of someone with identity and status, to appear as though they too have status, identity, and worth. Isn't that all it is? If you imitate an ordinary person, it's not much of an issue. At most, it's just an arrogant disposition. But if you imitate God's tone and manner of speaking, that's where the trouble starts. Let me tell you, you'll be stepping on a landmine. In God's words, there is a phrase, God is a God who abhors evil. What does abhorring evil refer to? God's identity and status are unique. God's holiness, righteousness, authority, and love are attributes that no created or non-created being possesses. To try to imitate these is blasphemy. Since you don't possess these attributes, why would you attempt to imitate them? Since you don't possess them, why would you try to be God? In imitating, are you not harboring the intention to be God, to become God? Or is it because you adore God, because you envy His loveliness and essence, that you imitate Him? Absolutely not. You lack the character and stature for it. You just want to satisfy a craving to be God, to gain people's admiration and respect, and receive treatment like God among people. Isn't this a shameful act? It's utterly disgraceful. Imitation in itself is repugnant, and aspiring to be God is not just disgusting, it's condemnable. Therefore, today I solemnly tell you that no matter what I have said, no matter what I have done, no matter what I say or do that arouses reverence, envy, or jealousy in your hearts, there's one thing you must remember: never imitate me. You must let go of the intention to imitate. You must rebel against the mentality of imitation and avoid offending God's disposition. This is a grave matter. A corrupt human taking God's tone of speech, manner of speaking, and disposition as a trifling matter to pay lip service to arbitrarily manipulate and play with, is detestable to God. If you do so, then you are offending God's disposition. Never do this. Even if I can't hear you imitating the speaking manner and tone of God incarnate, merely knowing you have such a disposition and such thoughts makes me utterly disgusted. If you imitate the tone of the Spirit of God, intending to address all of humankind or the public, aren't you seeking death? This is something everyone should be vigilant about. Never do this. Some people used to ask, what does it mean to offend God's disposition? Today, I'll tell you one thing. Imitating God's tone and manner of speech, as well as a series of things related to God's identity and status, whether external or internal, all constitute an offense against God's disposition. You must absolutely remember this and never commit this offense. If you do commit this offense and can promptly correct, rebel against, and transform yourself, then there's still hope. However, if you persistently continue down this path, you'll be characterized as an antichrist. And let me tell you the truth. In God's eyes, there'll be no room for turning around then. You will be utterly finished. Remember, God is a God who abhors evil. You must treat every aspect related to God's identity and essence with the utmost caution and not take it lightly. If God's manner of speaking and tone are expressed from the mouth of a corrupt human, it is an immense humiliation and blasphemy against God, something God absolutely cannot tolerate. Humans must never, ever commit this offense. Do you understand? If you commit this offense, you die. If you don't listen and don't believe me, try it. And when you really bring disaster upon yourself, don't blame me for not telling you.